Hi guys, so we're going to discuss now types of sources. There are three main types of sources in research: general sources, secondary sources, and primary sources. I'm going to give you some examples of these three types of sources. Okay, so the first type of source that we look at is the general source. General sources are things like newspaper articles and magazines. These are particularly relevant when we are doing literature reviews with limited research available. So let's say, for example, that we are doing a study on gang violence in Belize. In that case, since there is such limited research available in Belize, we would want to use general sources, newspaper articles, or news articles for our literature review. So we might want to come to Channel 5, for example, and look up what they have about gang violence in Belize. This is an example of a general source. Let's look now at secondary sources. Secondary sources are sources once removed from primary sources. What does that mean? Primary sources are things like journal articles where a researcher has actually done the study. Secondary sources take that information from those research articles, put them together, and write or discuss or analyze these. So books are an excellent example of secondary sources, since they are not actual research that has been conducted, but instead discuss research that has been conducted. For our purposes, this book might serve as a perfectly good secondary source for our literature review, since it speaks about gangs in the Caribbean. Now you might say, but Miss, we are studying gangs in Belize. Why would we look up a book about gangs in the Caribbean? Belize and the Caribbean share a rich history together and are very similar. So it would be very relevant for us to use this book about the Caribbean. There is also more extensive research conducted in the Caribbean that could help to inform our study in Belize and help to form a hypothesis. So this book might be very good for our research project. Also consider, when you are doing your own research, that you want to look at samples, that is, groups of people that are similar to what you are studying or who you are studying. So if you are doing, for example, university level students, you could find research articles about university level students in Thailand, the Philippines, Turkey, the US, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Chile. Why not? If you are studying university level students, then it is likely that people from other countries or other groups that are similar to the ones you're studying here in Belize have similar experiences. And if they don't, that is still valuable information for your research. So don't limit yourself to only Belize when you are doing a research study, particularly because we are very young in the research arena and some topics don't have as much research as other topics. So going outside of Belize to find articles and sources that are similar in nature is a perfectly okay thing to do. So secondary sources are sources that summarize, discuss, analyze research that has been conducted in a particular area. Books are one example of secondary sources. Here we have a chapter of a book, and I have highlighted Hill 2012 and Katz and Kowait 2006 that we can see this book is citing. We see then that it is in fact extracting information from somewhere else to discuss here in this chapter. We can also see here that the UNDP 2012 is being cited. So A secondary source will usually have multiple other sources of information. In this case, we have the UNTP 2012, Hill 2012, and Katz and Coe 2006, just in this initial paragraph alone. And there is, of course, more as you go down throughout the book. Now, we are talking about the literature review, so you might say, but Miss, is a literature review then also a secondary source? If you're thinking along that line, then you are absolutely right. A literature review is an example of a secondary source. And so are reports generally. So reports can also be secondary sources because they sometimes take away from research that has also been conducted. So you do want to be careful with reports because reports aren't always primary sources. They can be secondary sources. Now, how do you tell the difference in this case, for example, between a primary source and a secondary source? We're going to discuss that further in the lesson. So, examples of secondary sources: books, literature reviews, reports are all examples of secondary sources. This leads us to our third type of source, which is the primary source. Primary source are research that has been conducted in a particular topic. This, for example, is an example of a primary source. In this case, all of these authors conducted research in this particular topic that we have up here, which is an assessment of youth violence in 5 Caribbean countries. We can see that in addition to a literature review, because remember, all research must have or do a literature review, in addition to the literature review, we can see that they have a method. This is an example of a primary source. They have a method of data collection, and they also have data analysis. So the question earlier was, how do you know, or how do you spot a secondary source from a primary source when they look very much alike? A primary source will have a method of data collection and a method of data analysis, as well as results reported and some form of discussion at the end. This is how you know that you are looking at a primary source. And for our purposes, we will be using only primary sources in phase 1, the literature review matrix, and we will be using any of the 3 sources for phase 2, the literature review.